Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the story of a single ship. It's a pretty dark tale, but its journey, as horrific as it was, actually became a major turning point in the fight to end slavery. Just listen to these words from a survivor of the slave trade, Ottobah Cugoano. They capture a brutal reality, a horror that one specific event was about to expose to the entire world. Let that number sink in for a second. 130. In 1781, that's how many living African men, women, and children were thrown overboard from just one ship. And let's be absolutely clear here. This wasn't some tragic accident. It wasn't the result of a shipwreck or a battle. This was a deliberate, calculated decision made by the crew. So, how on earth does that happen? How does mass murder become an insurance dispute? Well, let's get into the story and see how this horrific act was argued in a court of law, not as a crime against humanity, but as a simple financial loss. To really get what happened, we've got to meet the ship at the center of this tragedy. And, the first thing to know is that for more than 200 years, history's been getting its name wrong. For the longest time, the ship was known as the Zong, but that was just due to a simple mistake, a misreading of old, handwritten documents where an R looked like an N. Its real name was the Zorg. And this is where the story gets this incredibly dark, twisted irony. Because in Dutch, Zorg means care. Yeah, care. An absolutely haunting name for a ship that would become a stage for unimaginable cruelty. So the Zorg wasn't even originally a British ship. It was a Dutch merchant vessel that the British had captured. They then forced it into the infamous triangular trade route, and it left the coast of Africa with 442 captive people packed into its hold. Honestly, this voyage was a total disaster just waiting to happen. It was a deadly mix of greed and pure incompetence. The ship was dangerously overcrowded, they hadn't stocked nearly enough food and water, and there was a tiny crew of only 17 men. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they made huge navigation errors and ran into bad weather, making the journey way longer and way more deadly than it ever should have been. So now we get to the part of the story that's almost hard to believe. This is where a human tragedy gets twisted into a cold financial calculation. So, because of their own navigational mistakes, the crew found themselves running out of fresh water. And the solution they chose was just horrific. They decided to start throwing their human cargo overboard. Now, to understand how they could even think about doing this, you have to get your head around a key legal concept from that time. Under British law, enslaved people weren't considered human victims. They were legally defined as chattel, which basically means property, no different from a barrel of rum or a bale of cotton. And that dehumanizing law is what leads to this. Instead of the crew facing murder charges, the ship's owners actually sued their insurers. They wanted to be paid back for the value of the people they had just ordered to be drowned. They were literally filing a claim for lost property. So the insurance company, amazingly, refused to pay up. And that refusal is what brought this whole nightmare into a public courtroom, right where it caught the attention of a small but growing group of abolitionists. A man named Granville Sharp, a really dedicated anti-slavery activist, heard about the case, and he immediately realized this wasn't just an insurance dispute. This was a chance, a huge opportunity to expose the true horror of the slave trade to a public that mostly had no idea what was really going on. So the case went to trial, and it was a real legal battle. The first time around, the court actually sided with the ship owners. They said it was a valid claim for lost cargo. But Sharp and the insurers, they appealed. In the second trial, the decision was overturned. The claim was denied. But get this, not because it was murder, but because the crew's own incompetence had caused the water shortage in the first place. So the abolitionists technically won the case, but the judge's reasoning was absolutely bone-chilling. He basically said that throwing enslaved people overboard could be legally justified under the insurance policy. It just wasn't justified in this specific case because of the crew's negligence. It just laid bare how deeply the system had dehumanized Africans. But despite that twisted legal verdict, the damage was done. The story was out. And the public exposure of the Zorg massacre became this powerful, undeniable force for change. For the first time, people all across Britain were reading about this stuff in the papers. And they were horrified. The slave trade was no longer some abstract business happening thousands of miles away. The story of the Zorg made it real. It made it visceral. and it made it morally impossible to ignore. And you can literally draw a straight line from this one event to massive historical change. It's incredible. The massacre happens in 81. The public trial in 83 lights a fire under the abolitionist movement. Within a generation, the slave trade is outlawed, and then slavery itself is finally abolished. The story of this one ship had truly world-changing consequences. As the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass pointed out later, because the British Empire was such a huge player in the slave trade, when they abolished it, it was the beginning of the end for the institution of slavery all around the world. In the end, the Zorg became more than just a ship. It became the symbol for all the slave ships. A single, horrifying story that forced a nation to look at a truth it had been ignoring. It really leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it? The incredible power of a single story, to drag a giant injustice out into the light for everyone to see.